For a family of four, it's defined as making less than $26,000 a year. More than 38 million Americans live in poverty. For Black Americans, it's 1 in every 5, higher than Latinos, Asian Americans, and more than double the rate of white Americans. And it spills into all aspects of life. More chronic health issues, higher rates of divorce, and abuse or neglect. Climbing out can seem nearly impossible. It often requires a new job or a degree, much harder with fewer resources like transportation and childcare.
Income inequality is often cited as an important factor in holding people back. But a new analysis suggests Black boys and Black men face economic disadvantages even if they start off from a similar point of income and wealth as their white counterparts.
A new study released this week underscores just how big a gap African American males face when it comes to moving up the economic ladder. Some of the findings are dramatic. White boys who grow up in rich households are likely to remain that way. Black boys who are also raised at the top are more likely to become poor instead of staying wealthy in their own adult households. Black boys fare worse than white boys in 99% of America, even when children grow up next to each other with parents who earn similar incomes. Raj Chetty of Stanford University is one of the co-authors of this study. He joins me now. This report seems to indicate that Black men will fare worse than white men, even if they are raised in households with similar incomes. Can you explain what's happening there?
Yeah, so one of the most striking findings of the study to us was that even if you take Black and white boys raised in families at exactly the same income level, even at high income levels, you see that Black boys end up with very different outcomes on average relative to white men. They're less likely to complete high school, they're less likely to go to college, they have significantly lower earnings in adulthood. And that phenomenon, interestingly, applies really only to Black men. When we look at Black versus white women, you see much more similarity in their outcomes if they grow up in families of similar income. So it's something unique to what's happening to Black men in America that I think is really a concern for generations going forward in terms of perpetuating inequality by race.
And that inequality, it's really striking to me. One of the things that this study reports is that African American men who will grow up in households with two parents that are earning $140,000, they fare about the same as a white young man who is raised by a single mother making just $60,000. How can that be true? Because it feels so counterintuitive. And what does that mean for African American families and their futures?
Yeah, what you're getting at really is the finding that there's a great deal of downward mobility in Black families. So you would have thought intuitively, that's what we expected going in, is when you get to a certain income level, maybe racial disparities disappear, that at some point kind of escape the poverty trap. But that really doesn't seem to be the case. Even once your parents reach a high income level, it continues to be the case that Black men have higher odds of essentially ending up in the bottom of the income distribution than staying at the top of the income distribution. And that's why you get this pattern that Black men's outcomes look comparable to white men growing up in relatively low or middle income families.
You mentioned in the study that there are unique obstacles that Black men face. Just to be clear, are we talking about racism and racial bias, or what are those unique obstacles that Black men in particular face?
Yeah, so to try to get at that, we look at how this varies across different parts of the country. So look neighborhood by neighborhood and ask, are there some neighborhoods in America where you see small Black-white gaps, or perhaps Black men doing better than white men? And surprisingly, you find essentially no such areas. In 99% of neighborhoods in America, you see better outcomes for white men than Black men. Now, digging in deeper, you can ask, where do we see relatively good outcomes for Black men? And there are a couple of factors that pop out from that analysis. One, you see that areas with larger rates of father presence in homes among Black men, you have better outcomes for Black boys there. So if there are more two-parent families, particularly among African American households, you see better outcomes for Black boys. And second, you see that areas with lower levels of racial bias among whites tend to have better outcomes for Black men. So those are a couple of the factors that I think could be associated with these better outcomes, but I think more remains to be understood in terms of exactly what's driving these really sharp differences.
homies, I'm in heaven and they ain't got hoods.
Like many songs will tell you,
Bullet holes left in my peep holes.
the story of what housing and other living conditions look like for many Black Americans is pretty bleak, and that's by design. In addition to artists cataloging their very personal experiences,
When the landlord dissed us, no heat. Wonder why Christmas missed us.
it's been proven that the modern phenomenon of concentrated Black poverty was an intentional government-sponsored institution. This is in part why President Biden issued an executive order back in January, intended to right the historical wrongs Black folks have faced when it comes to housing and home ownership in this country. But first, let's take it back.
The dawn of the 20th century, African Americans in major cities lived scattered throughout the city. They weren't segregated particularly. It's only with the Great Migration of 6 to 7 million African Americans north and west escaping the South, the predominant response of the United States government and state and local governments to the Great Migration was to contain Black people in their own neighborhoods. And HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was particularly a part of this role. But the precursors to HUD introduced and encouraged racially restrictive covenants, redlining of every major city where African Americans landed. The federal government was a sponsor of urban renewal, infamously called Negro removal by the great James Baldwin.
Urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact.
That so-called urban renewal also included a federally sponsored interstate highway system, which was intentionally designed to mow through vibrant Black neighborhoods. Take Miami, for example. 2 highways, I-95 and I-395, bulldoze right through the predominantly Black and low-income Overtown neighborhood, previously called Colored Town during segregation.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development and the federal government writ large in the first 7 decades of the 20th century invested billions of dollars in racial segregation and concentrated poverty. Each time this country created a peculiar institution that subordinated Black people, slavery, Jim Crow, it created and dismantled it. They replaced it with another one. And the iconic Black ghetto, I don't use that as a pejorative, I use it as a descriptor, was a follow-on institution to slavery and Jim Crow. That's the legacy that every new administration inherits, and the Biden administration has as well.
Today, I'm directing the Department of Housing and Urban Affairs and Urban Development to redress historical racism in federal housing policies.
This executive order is just one of 4 signed by President Biden, designed to address racial equity in the United States. And while this progress is a step in the right direction, there's still a lot of harm to undo.
Segregation started coming down after the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which actually only got passed in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. In 1980, 8 out of 10 Black people would have had to move in order to be evenly integrated within metropolitan areas. Half of Black people who live in metropolitan areas still live in neighborhoods of high segregation. So we've had modest improvement, but segregation persists. And economic segregation has spiked since 1970. The so-called American dream is only working for a relatively small slice of the population that can afford to buy their way into what I call gold standard neighborhoods that have the best of everything. And everybody else struggles, and the Black poor struggle the most.
So what happens now? Well, some advocates are hopeful.
HOME applauds this executive order for really focusing on historical patterns of racial segregation and discrimination in housing,
while others remain cautiously optimistic. Here's Professor Cashin's suggestion.
I don't take credit for this, but I applaud it. There should be an equity analysis. The federal government spends so much money, it should track who's getting it by neighborhood, and it should pursue racial equity in the distribution of resources. There's been a lot of movement at the local level on this. For the example of Baltimore, they did an equity analysis and found that they were spending 4 times as much money in majority white neighborhoods as in majority black ones. I think we're in this moment where people are waking up, the realities of systemic racism, and I believe there is an ascending majority multiracial coalition that wants something better than a separate unequal nation that overinvests in some neighborhoods and disinvests and preys upon people in other neighborhoods.